Story 1. The old building where I worked had always carried an unsettling aura, like a relic from another time. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls whispered secrets from an era long past. One evening, while I was rummaging through some forgotten storage boxes in the basement, something strange caught my attention. A faint draft brushed my face, coming from what appeared to be a solid wall. Curious, I approached and began to inspect it closely. To my surprise, the wall wasn't as seamless as it seemed. There was a small, almost imperceptible gap between two panels. I pushed on one of the panels, and with a groan, it gave way, revealing a dark passageway. My heart raced as I peered into the narrow corridor, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I hesitated, torn between exploring further or calling for help, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. Grabbing a flashlight from a nearby shelf, I stepped inside. The floor was uneven, and every footfall echoed eerily in the confined space. As I ventured deeper, the hum of the building's machinery faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The walls were adorned with strange markings, some faded, others freshly etched. They resembled symbols, but none I recognized. My unease grew with every step, but I couldn't turn back. Eventually, the corridor opened into a small, circular room. It was unlike anything I had expected. The high domed ceiling loomed overhead, and at the center of the room stood an object that made my blood run cold, a large mirror. But it wasn't like any mirror I had ever seen. Its surface wasn't reflective in the usual sense. Instead, it shimmered faintly, like water rippling under the moonlight. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The mirror seemed to beckon me, its surface swirling as if alive. My reflection was nowhere to be seen, but within the glass, I saw faint shapes, figures, their faces obscured, moving slowly as if trapped in some unseen world. My pulse quickened. Then, a sound behind me made me whirl around. The passageway I had entered through had vanished, sealed shut as though it had never existed. Panic surged within me. I rushed to the wall, pounding on it, but it wouldn't budge. The only way out seemed to be through the mirror, a thought that filled me with dread. Turning back, I saw the figures within the mirror more clearly now. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow with sorrow. One of them raised a hand, pressing it against the glass as if reaching for me. Without thinking, I extended my hand toward it, drawn by an inexplicable force. The moment my fingers touched the surface, a jolt shot through me, cold and sharp, like being submerged in icy water. My vision blurred, and the room spun violently. When I regained my senses, I was no longer in the circular room. I stood in the middle of a vast, empty field under a starless sky. The air was thick, suffocating, and an oppressive silence surrounded me. I turned, desperate to find the mirror, but it was gone. In its place stood a figure, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Fear rooted me to the spot as it slowly began to approach, each step deliberate, its presence like a weight on my chest. As it drew closer, I made out its features, or rather, the lack of them. Its face was smooth, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth, yet I felt its gaze more sharply than anything I had ever encountered. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure stopped just in front of me, and though it had no eyes, I felt as if it were staring straight into my soul. It raised an arm, pointing to something behind me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned to look. In the distance, a faint glow pierced the darkness. It was the only source of light in this desolate place, and it seemed to beckon me. The figure remained still as I began walking toward it, my steps unsteady on the uneven ground. As I approached, the glow grew brighter, and I saw what it was, the mirror, standing alone in the field, its surface shimmering once again. Inside, the shadows moved more frantically now, their hands pressed against the glass as though begging to be freed. I hesitated, torn between the possibility of returning to the world I knew or being trapped forever in this nightmarish place. Suddenly, a wind howled through the field, carrying with it faint whispers, indistinct words, but filled with a sense of urgency. I reached out and touched the mirror once more, bracing myself for whatever might come next. This time, the pull was stronger than before, and I felt myself being yanked through. When my eyes opened, I was back in the circular room. The mirror stood silent and still, its surface dull and lifeless. The passageway behind me had reappeared, the faint hum of the building's machinery now a welcome sound. I stumbled out, my legs trembling, and rushed back to the basement. I never spoke of what I had seen, but from that day on, I avoided the basement. The building felt different now, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to return to the hidden passageway. And though I tried to bury the experience in the depths of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that part of me had been left behind in that otherworldly place, and someday, it might come back to claim me. Story 2. I crawled into bed that night, my body heavy with exhaustion after a long day. My phone, fully charged and sitting innocently on the nightstand beside me, was plugged in and ready for the day ahead. The room was swallowed in darkness, the quiet so deep that the hum of the world beyond seemed to vanish, leaving me alone in my cocoon of silence. As I drifted off, the faint glow of the phone screen blinked softly, a reassuring reminder that everything was normal. But when I awoke, something was off. My chest felt heavy, a strange weight pressing down as if the air itself had thickened. The phone, once lying neatly beside me, was now in a different position, as though someone had moved it while I slept. Groggy, I reached for it, only to find the screen black, the battery completely drained. How could this happen? It had been fully charged just hours before. Confused, I plugged it back in and waited, watching the screen flicker to life. That's when I saw it, texts. Messages I didn't recognize. They were from a number I didn't know, their content cryptic, unsettling. Each word seemed to crawl under my skin, as if written by someone teetering on the edge of madness, or worse, someone speaking from beyond this world. I stared at the first message for a long, frozen moment. You're not supposed to know it. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as some bizarre glitch, but there was something about it, something that made it feel like a warning, a message meant for my eyes alone, yet too dangerous to comprehend. I scrolled to the next message. You can't leave now. My heart skipped a beat. It was as if these words were written for me. But by whom? Who knew I was here, lying alone in my room? The timestamp revealed the horrifying truth. The texts were sent during the night, while I slept. But my phone had been on the nightstand, plugged in, not in use. How had these messages come through when I was unconscious? The next message made my blood run cold. They're coming for you. The words were desperate, pleading. Don't go outside. The urgency behind them was palpable, like a hand trying to push me back into the safety of my bed. But what was happening? Who was sending these? And why had they known I was asleep? The text's lack of punctuation and disjointed structure only added to the terror. It felt like a warning, but one that was wrapped in the threads of madness. Each new message seemed to grow more frantic, more insistent. I could almost hear the voice behind them, the twisted tone that urged me to stay inside, to hide. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a different unknown number. Look behind you. My breath caught in my throat. Without thinking, I spun around, my pulse pounding in my ears, only to find nothing. Just the empty, still room I had fallen asleep in. But then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A strange, gnawing feeling settled in my stomach. I checked the door. It was locked, just as it always was when I slept. I had been alone. So why did it feel like I wasn't? Desperately, I began scrolling through the settings, searching for some explanation, anything that could explain the madness of the texts. But then I saw it, an app one had never noticed before. It was a black icon with a red dot in the middle. No name. No description. I tried to open it, but the screen flickered, and just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. It was like my phone was hiding something from me. Something I wasn't meant to see. Panic gripped me. This wasn't just some malfunction, it was as though the phone itself was concealing something dark, something I wasn't supposed to know. I turned it off, then back on again, hoping for a reset. But the app was gone. The messages had stopped. Yet, the gnawing sense of being watched remained, like a shadow just out of sight, lingering at the edge of my vision. I sat in silence, staring at the phone, the once drained battery now partially charged, though I hadn't plugged it in. How could it have recharged itself? My mind raced. The fear, the strange app, the sense of being stalked, something wasn't right. I glanced at the clock. Just minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. I needed air, needed to clear my head. So I left the house, stepping outside into the cool night. But even then, the feeling lingered. I wasn't alone. Not really. As I stood there in the dark, the realization hit me like a weight. Whatever had happened during the night, whatever was behind those messages, it wasn't over. No. It was just beginning. Story 3. It was early morning when I first noticed them. The snow outside my door, pristine and undisturbed, had been blanketed the night before. But now, there they were, strange, unfamiliar footprints. They weren't animal tracks, nor were they the prints of someone I knew. They were deep, almost as if someone had trudged through the yard, yet I hadn't seen anyone approach. The footprints seemed to start right at the edge of my porch, just by the stairs, and led toward the woods behind my house. The marks were too perfect, too symmetrical, as if they had been deliberately placed. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. A chill crept down my spine as the truth settled in. No one had visited me the night before. No knocks, no unexpected arrivals. The footprints were an eerie reminder that something, someone, had been close, without me knowing. I stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots, moving cautiously toward the trail. These weren't the kind of prints one might expect from a casual passerby. They were too neat, too consistent. No one could have wandered aimlessly through the yard and left such an exact pattern. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, a sense of being watched crawling over me. Every step felt deliberate, my breath quickening as I followed the tracks, trying not to disturb their symmetry. They led me toward the edge of my property, where the woods grew thick and dark, swallowing the snow. The trail stopped at the trees, leaving nothing beyond. The snow there was untouched, as though the tracks had simply disappeared. Frozen, I stared into the woods, my mind racing. Was it a prank? A bizarre trick? But the longer I stared, the more it felt like something darker was at play, something that had left no trace of itself except for those haunting footprints in the snow. I turned back toward the house, heart pounding, my thoughts spiraling. Who had been out there? How had they left such precise marks without disturbing anything else? It made no sense, and the more I tried to rationalize it, the more unnerving it became. Inside, I locked the door, but the sense of unease clung to me. I tried to focus on other things, but the image of those footprints haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind. Later that afternoon, I ventured outside again, determined to find some explanation. The wind had picked up, making it harder to see the details of the prints, but I bent down, scanning the ground. That's when I noticed it, a faint smudge near the trees. As though someone had brushed against the bark. But there was no clear trace of what had caused it. The temperature dropped as the day faded into evening. The snow hardened, the ground growing cold and unyielding. Reluctantly, I went inside for the night, the strange events still circling in my mind. I locked the door behind me and sank into the warmth of my living room, but all I could think about were those footprints, those unnatural marks in the snow. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see more prints appearing as if something, or someone, was still out there, waiting. The night passed uneventfully, but when I woke the next morning, fresh snow had fallen, blanketing the yard once again. I rushed to the window, dreading what I might find. To my relief, the yard was empty. No footprints. No signs of disturbance. It seemed the strange trail had vanished overnight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Had it all been a dream? Or had something, or someone, been there? And if so, what did they want? The days passed without incident, but the memory of the footprints lingered like a shadow over me. I kept to my routine, rarely venturing outside, always glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. The feeling that something, or someone, was just beyond my sight never fully left. Then, a week later, I noticed something strange again. This time, it wasn't footprints in the snow, but a dark mark on my doorframe. At first, I thought it was just weather damage, the result of cold air or dampness from the snow. But as I examined it more closely, I realized it was something else, too deliberate, too precise. Almost as if someone had left me a message. But what did it mean? I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, my mind spinning. Was someone trying to communicate with me? Or was it just another odd coincidence? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for certain, the unease that had been growing inside me could no longer be ignored. Whatever had left those footprints was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I tried to forget it, tried to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone, but it crept back into my thoughts every time the wind howled or the snow settled outside. And every time, I couldn't help but glance toward the door, wondering if the footprints would return. Story 4. I had always felt safe in my apartment. It was on the third floor of a quiet building at the edge of town, far removed from the constant noise and chaos of the city. The windows were small, but the view beyond was serene, just a peaceful street, some trees, and the occasional jogger or dog walker passing by. It was the perfect sanctuary to retreat to after a grueling day at work. But lately, something had changed. It started with the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I dismissed it as the stress of my job, maybe even my own paranoia. I'd be sitting at my desk, reading a book or watching TV, and then, out of nowhere, I'd get this unsettling impression: someone was looking at me. I'd glance around, but the apartment was always empty, just as it should be. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing day. One night, after another exhausting shift at work, I returned home, desperate to crash into bed. I made a quick dinner, watched some mindless videos on my phone, and then retreated to my bedroom. As I lay down, that familiar unease crept back into my mind, but I tried to shake it off. Sleep never came. The feeling that something was wrong hovered over me, cold and persistent. And then I heard it. The faintest sound. A camera shutter, snapping in the distance. My heart lurched in my chest, and I sat up, frozen. Was it my imagination? Or had someone really just taken a picture of me? I scanned the room frantically, my pulse quickening. The apartment was empty, the blinds gently swaying in the moonlight. But my mind was racing. Had someone been outside, peering in at me? I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and opened the camera app. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something inside me told me to check. I scrolled through my recent pictures, mostly of friends, a few random shots of the city. But then, towards the end of the album, my stomach dropped. There it was. A photo of me, sleeping, taken from outside my window. The image was blurry, but unmistakable. Through the sheer curtains, I could see the outline of my bed, the blankets covering me. The angle of the shot made it clear, someone had been standing outside, hidden, watching me as I slept. I felt the blood drain from my face as I clicked through more photos. Dozens of them. Some were taken from different angles, some close-ups of my face as I slept. Others showed the outside of my apartment, the window, the street. Each photo sent a chill down my spine. But the last one, God, the last one was the worst. It was a close-up of my window, with my own reflection staring back at me, only there was something else in the image, a shadowy figure standing just behind me. I froze, staring at the photo, my mind spiraling. Who could have taken these? How long had they been watching me? I quickly checked the window. The blinds were partially open, slightly askew, as if someone had just moved them. I hadn't touched them. My stomach twisted. Someone had been inside my apartment, someone who had been so close to me, I had no idea they were there. I rushed to the phone, trying to call the police, but the words caught in my throat. How could I even explain this? That someone had been taking pictures of me while I slept, but I had no idea who they were, or how they got in. It sounded insane. But the evidence, those photos, was undeniable. I couldn't ignore it. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, ensuring everything was secure. And then, something else caught my eye. The blinds. The ones where the photos had been taken. They were off, slightly open, a position I hadn't left them in. I hadn't touched them. Panic surged through me as I realized, someone had been inside my apartment, adjusting the blinds, without me knowing. I called the landlord, asking if anyone had come by for maintenance. The answer was no. I asked about any reports of suspicious activity in the building, but the landlord seemed confused, assured me everything was fine. But I knew better. Someone had been in my space, someone had been watching me, and I had no idea who they were, or how long it had been going on. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the photos on my phone, unable to delete them, even though I knew I should. Each image was a reminder that I wasn't alone. Someone had been lurking in the shadows, watching me without my knowledge. My once safe apartment had become a prison. The next morning, I called the police. They took the photos and promised an investigation, but I knew that nothing would erase the feeling of violation. As I sat in the police station, waiting for my statement to be taken, a single thought consumed me: whoever had been watching me was still out there. Still waiting. Story 5. When I moved into the old house, I never expected anything strange. The place had been sitting on the market for months, its weathered walls and overgrown yard telling stories of abandonment. But I needed a fresh start, and this house, with its creaky floors and empty, echoing rooms, seemed like the perfect place to rebuild my life. On my second day, while unpacking boxes in the living room, I noticed something. Above the fireplace, hanging on the wall, was a large family portrait. It was an old photograph, slightly faded, framed in tarnished gold. The family in the picture smiled, dressed in clothes that screamed decades ago, but there was something about them, something unsettling. I couldn't quite place it, but their faces felt eerily familiar. I stepped closer, trying to pinpoint what was wrong. There they were, the mother, father, and two children, a boy and a girl. The mother had long brown hair, the father's smile warm but distant, and the children were laughing, the boy's arm draped around his sister's shoulder. The more I studied their faces, the colder my spine became. A strange feeling twisted in my gut, a connection I couldn't explain. It felt as if I knew them. As if I had seen them before. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to a trick of my tired mind. But the longer I stared, the more the creeping thought began to take root: the children in the photo, they looked just like me and my brother when we were young. The same hair. The same eyes. Even the same smiles. My heart began to race. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and scrolled through old family photos, searching for any that might match the one on the wall. When I found it, an old snapshot from a family vacation, I froze. The resemblance was uncanny, the same poses, the same smiles, even the same beach in the background. I took a step back from the portrait, confusion and dread swirling inside me. How could this be? This house had been empty for years. There was no way this photo could have been taken in my family's home. Then, like a punch to the gut, the realization hit me: this wasn't just a random portrait. It was a photo of my family, but from years before I was even born. How could that be? The timeline didn't make sense. Driven by a surge of fear and curiosity, I went next door to speak with the elderly woman who lived there, hoping she might know something about the house's past. She opened the door with a warm, but wary, smile. When I told her about the portrait, her expression shifted. "That house has been around for a long time," she said, her voice low and cautious. "It belonged to the Anderson family, but they moved away many years ago. I don't think anyone's lived there since. Except for the occasional caretaker." I asked her if she knew why they left so suddenly. She hesitated before answering. "The Andersons were a nice family," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But they left, abruptly. No one really knows why. It was like they vanished overnight." Her words lingered in the air like a bad omen. I thanked her and returned home, my mind racing. Who were the Andersons? Why did their family photo look so much like mine? Could it be some bizarre coincidence, or was there something more sinister at play? That night, I couldn't shake the thought of the portrait. I couldn't rest, couldn't ignore the strange pull it had on me. I returned to the house, unable to resist. The moment I entered, the portrait seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its familiar faces staring back at me with unsettling intensity. And then I saw it. At the bottom of the frame, barely visible in the darkness, was an inscription. I leaned in, my breath caught in my throat as I read the faded letters. "To our family, always. The Andersons." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a message. The Andersons, somehow, in some way, had known my family. But how? Why? The connection was undeniable, and yet, I still couldn't understand it. As I stood there, the air thickened around me, the room closing in, the walls seeming to whisper of long-buried secrets. The past wasn't as distant as I had hoped. It was here, waiting to reveal itself, to pull me deeper into its tangled web of truth and terror. And somehow, I knew, this house wasn't just a place I'd moved into. It was a place that had been waiting for me. Story 6. I pulled into the driveway, the familiar outline of my house offering a fragile sense of comfort after a long day at work. The sky had already begun to darken, and the air held a biting chill that signaled the arrival of evening. But as I approached the front door, something immediately caught my attention: the door was unlocked. I froze, staring at the handle, my heart hammering in my chest. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. The memory of the click of the deadbolt echoed in my mind as I replayed the morning in my head. But there it was, wide open, as though someone had entered while I was gone. Hesitant, I stepped inside, the faint scent of something unfamiliar clinging to the air. The house was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floorboards, all gone. I glanced around the hallway, but nothing seemed amiss at first. Still, an unease gripped me as I slowly closed the door behind me and locked it again. The feeling of something being off only deepened as I checked the windows, making sure they were secure. But no matter how many times I scanned the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't until I stepped into the living room that I saw them: shoes. A pair of large, polished black shoes, sitting neatly by the couch. Expensive, well-kept, yet utterly out of place. I didn't recognize them. I lived alone. No one had been in my house for days. They didn't belong to any of my friends or family. And I was certain I had never seen them before. I took a cautious step closer, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, but the sight of the shoes twisted something inside me. The way they were placed so deliberately, almost lovingly, unnerved me. They looked like they had been set down with careful intention. My stomach churned as a horrifying thought crept in: had I left them there? Or had they appeared while I was gone? The possibility that someone had been in my home sent a cold rush through me. I quickly scanned the rest of the room. Nothing was out of place, except those damn shoes. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I couldn't ignore it. I moved toward the kitchen, checking the counters, the cabinets. Everything was in order. But there was an unshakable feeling that something had shifted in my absence. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, to calm my nerves, but the screen remained black. The battery had died. I cursed under my breath and went to plug it in, my mind racing with thoughts of who could have been in my house. As I plugged in the charger, I heard it, a faint sound from upstairs. A creak, like someone walking around in my bedroom. My blood ran cold. There was no way I had heard that correctly. My heart pounded as I stood frozen in place, listening. The creak came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something shifting on the floor. My legs turned to lead as fear seized me, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I backed away from the kitchen, inching toward the stairs. The house was still, but every small creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed magnified in the silence. My mind raced with questions, but none of them made sense. I hesitated. Should I call the police? Or should I investigate myself? The need to know what was happening in my own home overwhelmed me, so I moved toward the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the top, I paused at the hallway, staring down toward my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, a faint glow leaking from the crack. My stomach twisted. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed. The window was closed tightly. Everything was in place, but the air felt different. Heavier. Thicker. As if someone had been there recently. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning every corner. There was nothing out of the ordinary, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when it hit me. The shoes. The shoes that were still sitting neatly by the couch. I hadn't left them there. I was sure of it. My heart raced as I retraced my steps, replaying everything I had done that morning. I checked the locks. The windows. The garage. Everything was secure, just as I had left it. Yet the shoes remained, silently reminding me that something was deeply, horribly wrong. I reached for my phone again, praying that it had charged enough to turn on, but it remained dead. Panic clawed at me as I paced through the house. Who had been in my home? How had they gotten in? And why had they left the shoes? The questions echoed in my mind, relentless. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, in a place where someone unknown, had been. I grabbed my keys, stealing one last glance at the shoes by the couch before I stepped out the door. I locked it behind me, my mind still racing. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be coming back until I had answers. The night felt suffocating as I drove away, my thoughts consumed by the mystery of the shoes, and the terrible dread that clung to me, whispering that I wasn't alone, and I never had been. Story 7. It started with the late-night calls from an unlisted number. At first, I dismissed them, assuming it was a wrong number or some persistent telemarketer. I ignored the first few. But then they kept coming, one after another, every few hours. Every time I hesitated before answering, bracing myself for silence. And when I did, it was always the same, an eerie, suffocating quiet on the other end, as though someone was listening, but refusing to speak. I waited, heart pounding, expecting a voice, but the call would always end before anything happened. The first few times, I shrugged it off. A glitch, a prank, nothing to worry about. But they didn't stop. One night, as I lay in bed, the phone rang again. The unlisted number flashed on the screen. I hesitated, wondering if I should answer, my mind heavy with dread. I pressed the phone to my ear, expecting the usual silence. But this time, something was different. A faint whisper, so quiet it barely cut through the stillness, broke the silence. It was my own voice. I froze, the phone clutched in my hand, not sure if I had imagined it. The whisper was so soft, so fleeting, that for a moment I wondered if I had dreamed it. I strained to hear, but nothing came, just that oppressive silence again. My heart thudded in my chest, and I hung up quickly, a cold sweat creeping up my back. My mind raced, was it a prank? A system glitch? Or was something else happening? The calls didn't stop. Each one felt more intrusive, more real. And with each call, the whisper grew clearer, until it wasn't just random noise. I could almost make out the words. At first, it was just a jumble, something I couldn't quite understand. But each time, it felt more intimate, more personal, as if someone knew me, really knew me. The whisper sounded like me, twisted, distorted, but unmistakably mine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something, or someone, was observing me from the shadows. It felt like the voice was too close, too familiar. And the worst part was that it wasn't just over the phone. The whispers began to seep into my thoughts. I heard them even when the phone wasn't ringing. The voice didn't mimic me anymore, it spoke things I hadn't said out loud, things I hadn't even thought. The first time it happened, it was a fleeting thought, a simple, what if? But the next time, the whisper was more insistent. It said, "You're not alone." That's when the fear set in. The voice was more than a glitch. It wasn't a prank, nor was it a technical malfunction. This was real. And it knew things about me, things I hadn't shared with anyone. My grip on reality started to slip. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep, because the whisper was always there, always just out of reach, lingering in the quiet moments. I started to doubt myself. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining it? No. The voice felt too real, too intimate to be anything but someone who knew me in ways I couldn't explain. One night, after an especially long and exhausting day, the phone rang again. This time, I almost didn't answer. But something urged me to pick it up. I held my breath, expecting the usual silence, but instead, the whisper came through loud and clear. It was my voice. But it wasn't anything I had ever said. "I'm here. I've always been here." I dropped the phone, my hand shaking as I staggered back. The words echoed in my mind, crawling under my skin, a coldness settling deep in my chest. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a confession. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to leave, get away from the phone, get away from the whispers. Maybe, just maybe, I could escape. As I packed my bag, something caught my eye. A small, folded note in the pocket of my coat. My hand trembled as I unfolded it. The words on the note were simple, chilling. "You can't escape me." The handwriting was unmistakable. It was mine. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me like a thunderclap. The whispers weren't just coming from the phone. They were coming from me. From somewhere deep inside my mind. I wasn't sure if I was going insane, or if something more sinister was at play. But one thing was certain, the voice wasn't going to stop. It would always be there, lurking in the background, waiting. Always whispering, always just out of reach. I left my apartment, but the feeling of being followed never left. The whispers had become a part of me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. As I walked through the empty streets, I couldn't help but wonder, would I hear it again? Would it speak louder, clearer? Or would it remain a faint, chilling echo of my own voice, always just beyond my grasp? I couldn't escape. Not from the whispers. And not from myself. Story 8. It was a late evening when I found myself driving down a remote road, far from the comforting lights of the city. The winding path seemed to swallow me whole, with dense trees pressing in on either side, their dark silhouettes merging with the night. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine, a soft lullaby that did nothing to calm the growing unease in my chest. I had been driving for hours, hoping the isolation would clear my mind after a long, draining week. But the deeper I ventured into the wilderness, the more the silence began to suffocate me. The darkness outside felt heavier, pressing in like an unseen hand, and the headlights barely pierced the thick shadows ahead. The road was narrow, devoid of streetlights, and there was no sign of life, nothing but the ever-expanding void that seemed to stretch on forever. I started to feel the weight of it all, the stillness, like something unseen was watching, waiting. Then, in the distance, I saw something, no, someone. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, the figure became clearer. There, in the middle of the road, stood a person, motionless, facing away from me. As if they'd been standing there for hours, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. A part of me thought about stopping, offering help, but something about the figure stopped me cold. It wasn't just the stillness, it was something deeper, something wrong. The figure wore a dark coat, and their posture was rigid, unnaturally so. My instincts screamed at me to drive on. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and I sped past them, my pulse racing. I dared a quick glance in the rearview mirror. And then, my blood ran cold. The figure was gone. There was nothing behind me but the dark road stretching endlessly into the night. A heavy silence enveloped me, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I had imagined it or that they had stepped off the road. But the more I tried to reason, the more I felt a creeping terror, a gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. That figure hadn't been just some passerby. No, it felt far darker, far more sinister. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to shake off the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, watching me. The road twisted ahead, and the further I drove, the more I felt eyes on me. Every shadow seemed to twitch just out of the corner of my eye, every tree hiding something. My mind raced with explanations, but none of them could ease the suffocating unease in my stomach. I passed a small turnoff, a dimly lit gas station standing alone in the distance. The flickering light above the door was the only sign of life for miles, and I pulled in, desperate to clear my head. As I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to dispel the thick, uneasy sensation that had settled deep in my gut. I walked over to the pump, trying to focus, but my thoughts kept returning to the figure. How long had I been standing there, lost in my thoughts, when I heard it? A faint sound. Footsteps. A rustle in the leaves. My heart leaped into my throat. Slowly, I turned around. There, just beyond the dim light of the gas station, stood the figure. My breath caught. It was them. The same person from the road. I couldn't see their face, but I knew it was them. Standing in the exact same position as before, just out of the reach of the light, like they'd been waiting for me to return. My body froze. I wanted to scream, to ask what they were doing there, but my voice betrayed me. The air felt thick, suffocating, like time itself had stopped. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching, waiting. With every ounce of willpower, I backed away toward my car. My legs were leaden, my pulse pounding in my ears. I fumbled for the keys, my hand shaking violently. Finally, I managed to open the door and slammed it shut behind me. Without a second thought, I started the car, slamming my foot on the gas. I didn't dare look back. But the road was darker now. The shadows seemed deeper, pressing in on me, like something was following, just out of sight. I drove faster, the engine roaring as I pushed the car beyond its limits. But no matter how far I went, that feeling of dread never left. Every corner felt like a new terror, every flicker of light a reminder of the darkness closing in. By the time I reached the nearest town, my hands were trembling, still gripping the wheel like a lifeline. I parked in a well-lit area and sat there, heart racing, trying to steady my breath. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that the figure had been a hallucination, a trick of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen them. And I wasn't sure I ever wanted to drive down that road again. When I finally gathered the courage to leave the car, I froze. There, in the dust on the corner of my windshield, was a handprint. Small, too small to be mine. Fresh. Like it had been placed there just moments ago. My blood ran cold. I had no idea who or what had been following me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Story 9. It was a quiet afternoon when I decided to clean out the attic, an almost forgotten space where time seemed to linger in the dust. As I sifted through old family documents and weathered photographs, my hand brushed against a forgotten box tucked away in a shadowed corner. Its cardboard surface was cracked, and it emitted a faint, musty scent of old paper and mothballs. Inside, I found stacks of yellowed papers, brittle letters, and photographs that seemed to carry the weight of untold stories. But one envelope caught my eye. A thick, cream-colored one, its edges frayed with age. What made it all the more strange was not just the faded handwriting, but the date, 1978, long before I was born. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling an unsettling chill creep up my spine. The name written across it was mine, yet the date suggested it belonged to someone from a time before I even existed. My heart pounded in my chest as my curiosity twisted into a cold knot of unease. Who had written this? Why? I sat down on the dusty floor, hands trembling, and carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of smooth, yellowed paper. The handwriting was elegant, formal, almost too deliberate. The first line chilled me to the core. To my future child, I hope this message finds you well. My breath caught in my throat. The letter went on to describe a future that hadn't yet happened, my life, my childhood, my very home. It spoke of the house where I grew up, the street where I had played, and even the color of my childhood bedroom. It detailed moments I hadn't yet lived, birthday parties with friends I hadn't met, vacations to places I had never seen, and a family secret I would one day uncover. It felt like a letter from someone who had already lived through my life, yet it was written to a future that hadn't come to pass. My mind raced. How could this be? How could someone from the past know things that had yet to happen? I flipped the paper over, desperate for an explanation, but the back was blank. There was no signature, no clue, no hint of who had written it or why it was meant for me. I ran my fingers over the paper, a sinking feeling gnawing at my gut. The more I thought about it, the more I felt as if this letter had been waiting for me, patiently hidden among the forgotten relics of my family's past. I didn't believe in strange coincidences, not anymore. This felt like something more, like a message from beyond time. I needed answers, so I took the letter to my parents. When I showed it to my mom, her face drained of color. She stared at the envelope in disbelief, holding it up to the light, inspecting it with trembling hands. "I don't know anything about this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not from me, and it's not from your father." My dad, though less shaken, looked equally perplexed. "Maybe it's a prank, a joke from someone in the family. But why would anyone go to such lengths?" The more we discussed it, the more eerie the situation felt. Who could have written this? Why? I spent the next few days obsessively going through family records, searching for any trace of the mysterious author. But there was nothing. No one recognized the handwriting, and none of the events described in the letter had any connection to our family's past. It seemed impossible. Then, one sleepless night, unable to shake the sense of dread, I decided to return to the attic, hoping to find something that would explain this strange message. As I rummaged through the box once more, I found another envelope. This one was dated 1980, just a few years before I was born. My pulse quickened. I opened it carefully, and inside was another letter, written in the same elegant handwriting. It, too, spoke of my future, describing things I had yet to experience, my first job, a decision that would alter the course of my life. It was nearly identical to the first letter, only more specific, more detailed. As I read, it dawned on me, the letters were connected. They spoke of events that hadn't yet happened, things that I was meant to experience, but who had written them? Why had they been left for me to find? The weight of the mystery pressed down on me, both exhilarating and terrifying. It felt as though my life had already been mapped out, as though the path I was walking had been planned long before I ever stepped onto it. I couldn't help but wonder, what other secrets was my family hiding? Was my life truly my own, or had it already been shaped by forces far beyond my understanding? As I left the attic that night, the letters clutched tightly in my hands, the chilling thought gnawed at me. Perhaps my future wasn't as unpredictable as I had once believed, and someone, somewhere, already knew what was to come. Story 10. When I first moved into my new apartment, everything seemed perfect, fresh, exciting. The space was small but cozy, bathed in sunlight every morning with a view of the city skyline that never failed to captivate me. I spent my days unpacking, arranging furniture, and familiarizing myself with my new surroundings. The apartment was quiet. A little too quiet, sometimes, but I chalked it up to adjusting to the change. One evening, after a grueling day at work, I decided to unwind with a hot shower. I turned on the water, letting the steam envelop me as I closed the bathroom door behind me. The heat felt good against my skin, and I allowed myself to relax, eyes closed, the rhythmic sound of the water soothing my tired body. It wasn't until I stepped out of the shower that I noticed something strange. The bathroom mirror, fogged by the steam, now bore faint writing. It was scrawled quickly, almost frantically, like someone had been in a hurry. I leaned closer, my heart skipping a beat, trying to make sense of the words. "You're not alone." I froze, my pulse quickening as a cold chill ran down my spine. I was the only one in the apartment. Or so I thought. I wiped the fog away with a towel, praying it was just a strange reflection or some sort of coincidence. But no matter how hard I wiped, the words remained. Panic gnawed at me. Maybe it was just residue from the previous tenants, I thought. But something felt off, like the message had been left for me, specifically for me. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was nothing. Just my imagination running wild. But the memory of those words lingered, haunting me as I went through my day. The next evening, after another exhausting shift, I stepped into the bathroom to take my shower, trying to push the thought from my mind. The steam began to fog up the mirror again, and for a split second, I wondered if I'd see the same message. When I finished my shower and stepped out, I went straight to the mirror. My blood ran cold. "I'm watching." The words were unmistakable, as if they had been waiting for me. No one had been in the apartment. The door had been locked. I hadn't heard anything. But here they were, as clear as day. I wiped the mirror again, but the message wouldn't disappear. I tried to rationalize it, maybe it was something to do with the mirror, with condensation or mold. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This wasn't some coincidence. The words felt deliberate, intentional, like they were placed there by something, or someone. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. But each time my mind wandered back to the mirror, a wave of dread washed over me. I left the bathroom light on, hoping it would somehow protect me. When I finally went to bed, I pulled the covers tight around me, trying to block out the creeping sense that something was lurking in the shadows, watching. Waiting. The next day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the building maintenance. When I asked if they'd ever heard of anything like this, the man on the other end sounded baffled. "No," he said, "nothing unusual. But he'd send someone over to inspect the plumbing and the mirrors." Later that afternoon, a maintenance worker arrived. I showed him the mirror, and he examined it carefully, running his fingers over the surface. "It seems fine," he said, shaking his head. "No unusual wear or damage." When I asked if steam could leave markings like that, he looked at me like I was crazy. "No," he said. "Steam clears up. It doesn't leave permanent writing." A cold shiver ran through me as I processed his words. The message had been there for hours before I even noticed it. There was no way steam could have left it like that. Not at all. After he left, I locked the bathroom door behind me, trying to push the fear away. But that evening, when I stepped into the bathroom, I knew what awaited me. The mirror was fogged, just as it had been before. This time, the message was different. "You can't leave." My breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I wiped the fog away. No doubt about it, someone, something, was leaving these messages. And it was no longer just strange, it was a warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment felt like a threat. Every shadow, a presence. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, trapped in my own home. The messages weren't just strange coincidences, they were something more. And the worst part? I was beginning to feel like there was no way out. The next morning, I packed a bag and left, heading to a friend's place. I couldn't stay there anymore. Not with the messages. Not with the constant feeling of being watched. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the thought that the words on the mirror were only the beginning.